My name's Gina Rippon, and I'm a professor of cognitive neuroimaging at the Aston Brain Centre, Aston University in Birmingham in the UK. And I've recently written a book called The Gendered Brain. There are certainly some biological differences between the brains from women and the brains from men, and I use that term carefully. Generally related to very basic physiological differences like hormone receptors and the different roles that men and women play in reproduction and the production of children. But the kind of differences that we're interested in understanding differences in behaviour and achievement and personality, nobody as yet has been able to characterise the brains from men as different from the brains from women. Stereotypes are actually very useful shortcuts, but generally they tend to be quite negative. So there is a view that, all Scotsmen are mean or all blondes are stupid, for example. They do serve a purpose in that we don't have to process everything about everybody we meet every time we see somebody new, but it's very often a negative outcome. I think gender stereotypes are very powerful, and I think in the 21st century they're becoming even more powerful because the kind of constant bombardment that we get from social media and from advertising and video games. I think there's a big push to really code men and women differently, and it starts very early. It starts even before children are born with these ghastly gender reveal parties, where 20 weeks before a tiny human arrives in the world, people are already trying to decide what kind of box they're going to fit into. I think we need to understand the power of the stereotypes to change the brain, which is really what my research has been looking at, to show that we're in a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where having different attitudes and expectations towards males and females will actually change their brains and produce brain differences, which will then carry on producing the kind of gender gaps that tend to sustain stereotypes. I could certainly imagine a world without gender stereotypes. There's a great book called Woman on the Edge of Time by Marge Piercy, which is a science fiction book, obviously, and it anticipates a world which is gender-free, in fact, in terms of it's gender irrelevant. And I think that would be a really good way forward, where it doesn't matter whether you're born a male or born a female, your role in society is determined by the kind of skills that you have. And nobody actually notices whether you're male or female. It's not very high up on their list of important characteristics. I think the term nature or nurture, or the concept of nature or nurture, is past its sell-by date. I think one of the things that 21st century neuroscience has shown is that if we look at our brains, the way in which our brains work, the way they develop, the kind of patterns of activity they show are hugely entangled with the world in which they function. So what we called either nature or nurture is really nature and nurture, and it's very difficult to separate them. So I think we need to look carefully, not only inside our heads at our brains, but also outside our heads, at what the world is doing to those brains. I work at the technical end of how the brain processes information, particularly with respect to individuals on the autistic spectrum. And we're starting to model different ways in which different parts of the brain connect to each other in trying to solve a problem or respond to something in the outside world. And we're starting to understand how the different types of brain signals that we can now measure actually act, how they become synchronized or how they don't become synchronized, and how they actually enable us to make the world a predictable place. And seeing the differences in the capability of different brains to achieve that predictability of the world, I think that's really exciting in understanding how some individuals find the world very confusing. Very often people confuse the fact that there is a metric called an IQ test with the belief that there is something, a genuine thing that we call intelligence. There's an old saying that intelligence is what IQ tests measure. But a lot of people believe that the number which is attached to an IQ test score is in some way meaningful, and somehow that has value attached to it, quite profound value. And the idea that you can distinguish people on the basis of a number which is generated by a very flawed test certainly worries me a lot. I think intelligence is a term or a concept which is way past its sell-by date. There is a misunderstanding of what people mean when they use the term intelligence. And I think it's a term that we should stop using. I think there are different skills that are required for different situations. People have different aptitudes and abilities. And I think we should focus on those rather than assume there's one kind of general ability called intelligence on the basis of which people can be discriminated against. I mean, there are some people who are good at some things or are better than some people at some things, and other people are better at other kinds of skills. I think it depends on what skill is required for the situation you're in. Sometimes what people mean by people being smarter is that people sometimes are slower at coming to the solution to a problem. But because, again, a bit like intelligence, the word smart has such a sort of socially constructed value attached to it that I get quite anxious when people talk about people being smarter than others. Well, the holy grail of any brain scientist is understanding a tiny bit more about how the brain works. So any tiny step along that pathway would be great. I think we're just in the foothills of understanding the brain. So any progress in that would be important. But I think also seeing how the research that we do into developmental disorders might translate itself into practice. Particularly with young children on the autistic spectrum, because it may well be that we could divert what looks like an inevitable pathway towards confusion and pathology by identifying early enough that there is a problem and actually seeing if we can divert it. I think you can, and again, the brain is much more trainable than we ever thought. And I think there are certainly ways in which you can help people increase their attention, either by increasing the attention span itself or by screening out distractive elements, or both. So yes, I think you certainly can train the brain to focus more. Practice makes perfect, actually. Finding out, understanding yourself, understanding your own limits, how what size chunks of time are best for you in terms of processing information. If they're short, can you make them longer? And some people can. If they are short, then how can you maximize what you do in those short times? And be aware that when you've come to the end of your allotted span, then you stop, because anything beyond that will be a waste of your time and your brain power and be frustrating. In terms of upper limits, it's difficult to determine when for so long there's been an idea that our brains are kind of fixed at birth. So your abilities are determined by the brain that you were born with. So we probably haven't really explored the upper limit of anybody's brain potential yet, because we've always had this idea that it's somehow fixed. One of the things that 21st century neuroscience again has shown, that our brains are hugely plastic and flexible throughout our lives. The brain capacity is not fixed at birth, or its potential is not fixed at birth. It arrives in the world eager to learn, eager to change according to different experiences. We may have a much more optimistic future in exploring our brain's potential. The brain is at its most plastic in very young children and also in adolescence. The brain is changing dramatically then and is very plastic. And we also know that there is a certain decline associated with physical deterioration in brain capacity as we get older, but it's nothing like as inevitable as we used to think it was, because we used to think brain cells don't change, you don't replace brain cells that you lose. So there was never any attempt to overcome this decline. Now we know that our brain is much more flexible. Then we have a better chance of understanding the inevitability or otherwise of this decline. So as we get older, certainly parts of our brain, as with the rest of our physiology, start to deteriorate. But there's a much better chance of slowing down that decline, or even halting that decline possibly, than we ever thought before. It's certainly possible to carry on educating yourself, and there's all sorts of, clever phrases like use it or lose it. But there's certainly evidence that if you continue to engage in learning activities as you get older, learning a second language, a musical instrument, doing the tango apparently is very good, then the inevitable decline you thought you confronted doesn't necessarily happen. And it's also the case that we're looking at ways of preventing or rehabilitating or replacing parts of the brain that have got damaged through disease or degeneration. So we have these systems called neuroprostheses, where just as we can replace missing limbs, we can replace missing parts of the brain. So if those are associated with the changes that we get through age, if we can prevent that, then there's a great possibility for all sorts of positive cognitive outcomes for older people. I would say that, wouldn't I? Actually working in brain science is really exciting. And I do like looking at the popular communication of science, even if it's, because I want to shout at the radio or throw something on the floor and say that's not what it's saying. So I think looking at what's going on in the world today with respect to brain science is really exciting. The most satisfying part of my job is actually solving a problem, or it sounds very nerdy, looking at a pattern of brain activation or the end product of a long computerized set of processes, and finding out that what I thought was going on, for example, when children were looking at a particular stimulus, does seem to be the case. So a nice, clear difference that I find I could explain. I do find that very satisfying. Any kind of administration. Yeah, I think that's it's actually what stops you having an interesting conversation. If you're so hidebound by the demands of a curriculum, for example, that you have to steer your students very severely down a very fixed path, I find that most frustrating. The biggest challenge is the fact that at the moment we don't really acknowledge individual differences in brains. I really believe, particularly if you work in the autism world, that every brain is different from every other brain. And yet the whole focus of brain imaging research to date has been trying to find the language area or the memory area, and you collect lots and lots of data from lots and lots of individuals, and you average it all together. So you're constantly losing all the richness of data, which I think is really interesting in order to understand the brain. Hugely complex, but maybe with the help of computers, we could actually start to look at the brains of individuals much more like fingerprints, identify them much more to do with individuals. So the biggest challenge is the fact that we throw away so much of our data. I'm still excited by what I do, so I think perhaps that suggests that there was, however accidental, a right path chosen at some point. There are other different things I think in retrospect I might like to have done, but we never know what the path not taken might be like anyway. So. As science is currently constructed, a young male scientist will still be confronting a different future, different set of challenges than a young female scientist, whether we like it or not. And I would say, as they generally appear to be quite negative for the female scientist, I would focus on her and say, at least be aware that you are going to confront these barriers. There are ways over it. There are people who can help you over it. There are role models that you can look at who have overcome those. So I think that would be the advice. The world will be different for you than from your male colleague. You can help work on that to change it, but you need to be aware that these different barriers will be in your way, on your way. I ride horses. And I love riding horses. I think that completely takes my mind off some of the more challenging things in my day-to-day job. Yes, probably horse riding. I think would be something I would like to focus on more as a hobby if I didn't have such an interesting day job. Cordelia Fine, in my own area, Cordelia Fine has written a great book called Delusions of Gender, which is, and I'm kind of hanging on her coattails really. It's really looking in detail about where this whole idea of gender came from. And as scientists, we would say there's a huge body of evidence supporting this idea, and this body of evidence has gone into the outside world and informed stereotypes. But stop, let's have a look and see how good this evidence is. So I think that would be a great book. There's a science book. Angela Saini has written a book called Inferior, which again is, she's a journalist, and it's a very accessible, very well-written book about how science, all sorts of different branches of science, have viewed women as inferior, as the men as the default option, woman is the inferior example. And that's a real eye-opener. I thought this was true of neuroscience, and yet she's looked at everything from anthropology to geography to primatology, for example, all sorts of different branches of science. I think it's a very readable book, very accessible. I love Doris Lessing's Golden Notebook, but that may be because I read it at a very significant time in my life and it really resonated with me. It may be if I was 18 now and read that book, it wouldn't make sense to me. But I'd be interested to know what today's 18-year-old might make of it. Well, I think there is another book. Whether or not my family would put up with me writing another book is another issue. But I think one of the messages I give about how the world changes the brain is very much in the context of typical behaviour. The way in which people normally function in the world, sometimes more or less efficiently, sometimes achieving as much of their potential as they could, and sometimes not. But there's a kind of darker side of that. And for some individuals, I think the way in which a gendered world, for example, can change a brain can actually change it quite detrimentally. And we get certain kinds of pathologies, such as high instances of depression and eating disorders and self-harm in women, high instances of suicide among young men, for example. So it's really looking at the darker side of what the world can do to brains. One thing. Could it be a Kindle? Can I take a Kindle? I'll take a Kindle loaded with lots and lots of books. A single sentence: a gendered world will produce a gendered brain.